Hi, I'm Lisa Fletcher, and you're in the stream. Today, massive protests, a social media frenzy, and demands for a death sentence. Bangladesh is at a virtual standstill after a war criminal escapes execution. But is this more than a search for justice? Our digital producer, Malika Bilal, is here looking out for all your live feedback. So, Malika, I've got TweetDeck up, and there is so much activity on Twitter right now about this topic, it's almost a little hard to keep up.
And just to give our viewers of how to give a sense of how popular and heated this debate has gotten, I pulled up on my screen this image of what's trending in Bangladesh. Just not too long ago, Shahbag, where the protests are happening, was at number 1, and AJ Stream is following very closely behind at number 3. Now, Twitter isn't huge in Bangladesh, but blogs and Facebook are, and we've already received 9,000 likes on the Facebook page for this show and 49 tweets per minute. So keep them coming. Use the hashtag AJ Stream.
All right, and joining us in studio is Tazrina Sajjad. She is a professorial lecturer at American University in the International Politics program. Tazrina, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You know, social media is playing a huge role in the conversation in Bangladesh. We are tracking it right now, in fact, from all angles. Here are some of the hashtags that we're following. Tens of thousands of people have descended on the streets of Bangladesh's capital for the last 2 weeks, calling for justice. It's a reaction to the February 5th sentencing of a convicted war criminal, Abdul Qadir Molla. Molla, a senior member of the Jamaat-e-Islami party, was given a life sentence by a tribunal for the beheading of a poet, the rape of an 11-year-old girl, and for his role in the killing of nearly 400 civilians in 1971. That was the year of Bangladesh's independence from Pakistan. As he left the courthouse, Molla flashed a victory sign, apparently a reaction to escaping the death penalty. The sentence and his reaction sparked outrage in Bangladesh, and since then, tens of thousands of people have rallied daily in the capital of Dhaka. The protests have been nicknamed Shahbag after the location of the main protests. Bloggers, writers, singers, teachers, students, even the country's cricket team are all taking part in these protests. Now, supporters of Molla and Jamaat have also held rallies. On Monday, they organized a general strike along with the opposition Bangladesh National Party to protest the deaths of 4 Jamaat activists. The strike also followed a government ruling on Sunday, which allows the state to appeal any war crimes tribunal decision. But the Shahbag rallies are turning into more than just a quest for justice. Joining us from Dhaka are Mahtab Haider, the former current affairs editor at Independent Television, and Sabanaz Rashid Dia, the founder of One Degree Initiative Foundation. That's a group that encourages young people to engage as active citizens and entrepreneurs. Both are coming to us from Dhaka. And Mahtab, I want to start with you. Provide a little context here for us. These are the biggest mass demonstrations the country's seen in 20 years. So clearly, this is about more than just anger over what people consider to be a weak sentence. Kind of briefly explain the war crimes trial and then the underlying political disputes around it.
Well, I agree with you. I think it's certainly true that the war crimes trials have triggered it, and there's a great deal of dissatisfaction over the verdict, which has triggered people to come onto the street. And the cause that very much right now is the cause that's bringing tens of thousands of people onto the street is very much justice for justice in these war crimes trials. But I think you're right. There's a bigger issue here, which is this is a new generation which is actually seizing agency and saying we can also, or we should also play a role and have a voice in determining the course of our nation's history. And I think this is a big picture message that is often lost in taking the chants that are coming out of Shahbag too literally.
Dia, the Bangladesh National Party claims that the government is using protesters to distract people from inadequacies within the current government. What do you say to that?
I think that's just a propaganda because we've been there almost every day
and there hasn't been any political dialogue, any partisan people speaking, or even if they were, it was a very short time. So it was just the regular people coming, getting together, really doing it. And it is not a political game. It is just people like you and me going out there and protesting without anybody really calling them. So I think it's completely mass people. It is not a political game at all. I completely disagree with that.
Mahtab, pick up on that a little bit because, Dia said that the organizers aren't letting political parties on stage, and this is quite a departure from the typical rallies that we'd see in Bangladesh that are often actually sponsored by various political parties. Would you call this particular type of protests that we're seeing unprecedented?
It certainly is unprecedented, Lisa. And the reason I feel it's unprecedented is because, as you say, normally the political culture with this kind of rally is that the political parties will have people bussed in, and various political leaders will bus citizens from their locality in to attend rallies. This has been the culture for decades. And as one prominent blogger recently commented when confronted with this accusation that there are party political motives behind this, he challenged the accuser by saying, please try and engineer something like this and show us that you can do it by paying people or by busing people in. It's impossible. I personally feel, I've been there several times now, and the feeling I've gotten there is certainly that people are there spontaneously. It's a lot of young people, and it's a lot of people who are saying they're dissatisfied with these war crimes, with the verdict in the Qadir Mullah case, and they're dissatisfied with, there's a sense of they want justice, not just in these war crimes trials, but in a broader sense of that word.
That dissatisfaction is coming across via Twitter. Someone says, impartial youth have a voice now. A lot of political people did not admit we existed before now. But then on the issue of whether or not this is politicized, Rezwan says, Shahbag is apolitical. No political slogans, banners, and speeches allowed. Don't listen to the paid trolls. But Tazrina, on the other hand, of course, there's dissent. Abbas Islam Khan says it is political. No doubt about that. Shahbag is led by student wing of the ruling government. And another tweet from Rezwan who agrees and says, there may be some, but they're not allowed in the podium to talk politics. Bloggers have been wanting this trial since 2006. So we're talking about whether it's political, whether it's not political. Aside from that, though, what is the significance of these protests?
There are many ways of looking at Shahbag, and I think one of the most important things to point out is the fact that the selection of Shahbag as the rallying point for this kind of mobilization is extremely important, because if you study the history of Bengal, if you study the history of Bangladesh, Shahbag has been a historic site for a lot of popular uprisings. A lot of them have been non-violent against, for example, the British Raj, and of course throughout the period of the 1950s, the 1960s, leading up to the Liberation War of 1971. The second issue is the question that, for example, Lisa talked about, the unprecedented nature of the movement. And I think that it again needs to be understood in terms of the kinds of political mobilizations of common people that have happened throughout the history of Bangladesh, not just in the lead up to the 1971, but also even afterwards. For example, the fall of the military dictatorship after 9 years. And that was also something that where political parties played a distinct role, but again, it brought in a lot of people who felt that they wanted to own the political process. So I think it is important to recognize some of these key elements. The fact that the youth, and a lot of people are commenting on the fact that the youth feel that for the first time that they can take ownership, and use of social media makes them empowered in a way they haven't been able to reach out to each other, irrespective of important issues that have made society what it is, such as class, such as distinctions in terms of political ideology, and a whole host of other factors. The movement is also intergenerational. Obviously, a lot of youth are involved, but there are also people who have revoked, for example, their sentiments from 1971 onwards. There are people from different classes that are mobilizing, and there are a whole host of women is another factor I believe we will touch on, and of course the issue of the fact that for the first time in at least 20 years, if not more, people feel that they are taking ownership of a public space for certain kinds of demands that people should demand in terms of accountability in governance. So the question that was posed to Mahtab was the question of justice, and I think that is the central argument that needs to be had and be fleshed out more in terms of what does justice mean,
Right.
not only in terms of 1971, but in terms of people's relationship to their democratic government.
Well, Tasrina, you mentioned social media, and Shahbag protests have largely been organized via Facebook and by groups of activist bloggers and just various people online. We want to take a look at some of the Facebook pages that have actually rallied people to the protests. Here are a couple of them. Now, on Friday, one of the bloggers, Ahmed Rajib Haider, was found dead outside his home in Dhaka. Now, initially, Jamaat-e-Islami was blamed, but the group then denied the attack. So far, no evidence has actually tied that group to the killing. Tasrina, there hadn't really been much violence associated with all of this, at least in the first 10 days. Now we're into it 2 weeks. We see the death of this blogger. How does that change the landscape?
I think a lot of these discussions with regard to Shahbag and the political climate of the country has to be understood within the larger social and security climate. The political climate in the country had been tenuous for a while, and the fact that the War Crimes Tribunal was running is one of the many factors. There has been obviously opposition to the existing government, as well as a whole host of other kinds of political tensions. So I think it is important to keep that particular issue in mind. But I think that there must have been some kind of understanding that, of course, when the verdict comes out, whatever way it might be framed, there will be dissatisfaction either in support of or in opposition to.
Sure.
And with regard to the verdict, obviously, large numbers of people have shown that they're not satisfied with the life imprisonment sentence. But I think that one of the important issues to also point out is that it was not expected. I don't think Shahbag was something that people expected. The fact that a largely non-violent movement bringing together so many people, that is quite organized and quite remarkable in a country that has violence embedded in its political culture, is actually able to pull this off every day in such an organized fashion.
It's interesting that you say that. Dia, you recently wrote an article that I've just pulled up on my screen for the Daily Star, Because We Stood Witness, and in it you say after the sentencing you weren't expecting it to create chaos other than the usual burnt buses and partisan hotspots. What came as a pleasant and awaited surprise. Before you tell us about why that was such a surprise to you, there's tweets that agree with you. Taif says, Shahbag gives Bangladeshi youth a platform who are politically unaware but don't like existing partisan politics, showing some of that same surprise. Can you tell us why you were so surprised?
I think it's because we've been waiting for a very, very long time for Bangladeshi youth to sort of, come together and do something. But, because I think what Tasreen touched upon, that we have a very violent political scenario. There's partisan politics, there's dynastic politics, there are people it's very difficult for us to go out on the streets and actually make a statement. So I think for me it was a surprise, and for everybody it was a surprise, because it actually happens so organically and without really anybody really calling them. And the fact that it actually did happen. And there's always this saying that my generation is people who are not really interested into politics. They want to run away from the country. They're very apolitical. They're always into Facebook. And for them to actually be so passionate about something that happened 40 years ago, that is still sort of lingering behind, and that really sets the country's tone for the next 40 years, I would say. So I think for that organic movement that really happened, for that, it was a huge surprise for us.
Mahtab, do you see clear leadership for this movement right now?
I do see leaders emerging, but I think the beauty of this movement is that there isn't any organized leadership per se. I think it's because it's such a spontaneous protest, I think people are just going there and acting on their own conscience. They remain there on their own conscience rather than through a call from political leadership. And I think this is what makes it unprecedented as well, because it rises above any kind of organized party political structure. And it's diverse groups of people who are going there and voicing that single demand that they want to see justice done.
When we were preparing for the show, we spoke with a lot of people in Bangladesh about the protests. We want to give you all a chance to listen to some of what they had to say.
Basically, the whole thing took off online through Facebook, through Twitter, and blogs. People were informing each other that all this was going on, and this is what happened. We're outraged. Come join us. This is we're here. So if you feel the same way, let's all be on the same page.
What we see at a personal level is just this amazing sense of our voice, our strength being gathered in some place where we can say something, demand something, and there is going to be some reaction to it. And so that is sort of like the collective confidence that has been built up.
Speaking of that collective confidence, our community is also weighing in. We've got 63 tweets per minute as of right now. So this is a very hot topic. Ami on Twitter says, I don't support Bangladeshi politics, and this is the beginning of youth standing up for their beliefs. A Facebook comment from Nafisa, this movement could change the face of tired old politician tactics in Bangladesh. It's refreshing to see the youth so observant, aware, and adamant. But Mahtab, lest we think that all of our community members are in favor of these protests, listen to this video comment from someone critical of them.
These protesters are asking for execution of Abdul Qadir Mullah and all those arrested under the flawed war crimes tribunal before trials are even complete. They're asking for opposition parties and their institutions and media to be banned and have incited violence against them. These aren't progressive liberal values. Shahbag should be seeking stronger democratic practices, not revenge.
Mahtab, what do you make of that?
Well, I think there's a lot of expectation now from liberals across the board who want Shahbag to be everything that liberals haven't been able to achieve in the past 20 years since a dictator was toppled in 1990. And I think, you know, the young people who are there, they're there on a very actionable cause, and they're there. If again, the important thing that I'd like to point out here is that there's a risk of taking the chance too literally. What they're saying there is that they want the maximum sentence for the war criminals, the maximum legal sentence applicable under Bangladeshi law for the war criminals. And in this case, it is capital punishment. So they're not asking for anything illegal. And as for critical views, I think it's very important to have these discussions. But I think liberals are also expecting a lot more from Shahbag than it can deliver at this juncture. I think we need to convert Shahbag from an event into a process for liberals to get everything that they want from society.
But Tasrina, he mentioned that they're not asking for anything illegal, but I want to get your thoughts on whether, you know, passing a retroactive law aimed at appeasing, I guess some might say, the whims of popular demand to make sure that the government can then step in and make sure that defendants are able to get the death penalty. Does that do anything to the rights of the defendants?
I think there are questions and criticisms with regard to the International Crimes Tribunal process. I think whether we have agreed with the Crimes Tribunal process, the way it has been conducted, or we have legally approached it, or we have looked at it from a human rights standpoint, the process has not necessarily always been perfect. But I think if you look at the demands of the people from Shahbag, it's a 6-point sort of demand. And the question is just larger. Obviously, the flashing of the victory sign has been sort of pouring salt on an open wound. And that has been the mobilizing call for the people to mobilize in a particular area. But if you look at the larger questions at play in this particular instance, it is about trying all those responsible who were involved in the commission of war crimes in 1971. It is about banning of a political party that people generally feel have largely used the structures of political impunity that has grown over the last 40 years or so, has been part and package of the climate of political violence. Of course, they themselves don't have the monopoly over the use of violence in Bangladesh, but they certainly have used it. And the killings of the cartoonist and the blogger point out to the security question. So I think the larger questions with regard to justice, whether you are talking about legal reform, and there are many other discussions to be had about the future of capital punishment in Bangladesh. I think there's a lot of discussion that still hasn't been had.
Well, in terms of the larger issues, and Dia, I want to bring you back in here. The Bangladeshi War of Independence was in 1971, and a lot of academics believe that that was really the first time that rape was consciously used as a weapon of war. And there are estimates up to about 400,000 women that were raped during that war, put into rape camps. And now we look at these massive protests in Bangladesh, which women are at the core of. They've been organizing. We're seeing mothers, professionals, wives, grandmothers, all out on the streets. Do you think this is somehow in reaction to what happened to women in 1971?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that, when you sort of raise that question, the fact that Bangladesh has come so far in 40 years, it's a very young democracy, and the fact that women are more empowered and they feel like it is their time to stand up, to the past, to the fact that there were so many women who were raped at that time. I think that's definitely very, very, that's a very strong stance. And one thing I would like to mention is that Jahanara Imam, she was one of the people who sort of started the whole war tribunal process, the war criminal trial process. And she was a woman, she lost her son, and there were people that she was involved with who were raped. And I think, the fact that it is her calling that was even resounded and echoed through so many young people, particularly women, that itself shows that it is definitely, it does touch upon that point of, women coming together and sort of seeking justice for the past. Absolutely.
If I may interject here, I think the involvement of women is very significant. Again, I will talk about it in the context of, first, women's involvement in Bangladeshi politics and Bengali politics precedes Shahbag, and it is something that we need to keep in mind. The second is, of course, women's role in the context of Bangladeshi development has been significant. I think it has already been pointed out in terms of education, health, political participation. Women have been out in the streets, in the economic structures, in the political structures for quite a while. So it is not surprising for a lot of us observing Shahbag right now in terms of the sheer numbers of women who are taking part in the activism, the organization, and the leadership roles. But it is also important to point out that wars that have a tendency to also target women, particularly for sexual violence, and of course 1971 was not the only instance where sexual violence has been used in the context of warfare. It has been happening for a long period of time. It still happens. But the fact that that is also a very raw wound. People remember it. People have been forced to live in shame. People have been expected to forget, and I think that those are very core issues. If you're talking about issues with regard to women's rights, and yes, women have made a lot of strides in the context of Bangladesh, but still we are struggling with issues with regard to domestic violence, with regard to questions of sexual violence. So I think that this is a rallying point with regard to women's rights in a multidimensional sort of framework.
And on that note, we're getting tweets just on this topic. Pushpa says, I have been treated like a sister from all of my brothers at Shahbag. It makes me so proud to be from Bangladesh. And another tweet from Shah Ali Farhad, who says, this is the first time that women have felt that a movement is civilized enough for them to participate in. Hats off to Shahbag. Dia, I wonder, you've been at the protest. Are you seeing that same sort of sentiment?
Absolutely. I mean, I think Tajin sort of touched upon, there is domestic violence, and she did say women may have had a very long role. We have been in the development sector, we have been in leadership roles, but for young women just like myself to come out to Shahbag, be part of something as open, as active as a rally, without being in the streets all night, I think that is a phenomenal achievement, and I definitely feel much safer there. I feel like there are people who are my brothers. We are fed at night. There are people who are sort of taking care of us. Strangers who would take you to a hospital if you were feeling sick. I think that is incredible. That sort of people coming in together and acting like a family. Absolutely.
Mahtab, as we've discussed, there are a lot of issues that have come to light around this flashpoint of the sentencing verdict. But if you had to maybe boil it down to one thing, what do you think the protesters in Bangladesh are hoping to have happen? We've got about a minute left in the show.
Well, for me, I think having spoken to many people who are there, it's very clear this is a call for justice. What that justice means, represents, or I think how people interpret justice may differ. But I think liberals across Bangladesh are putting themselves in Shahbag and saying this is a call for justice, and this is a clear message saying we are seizing agency back, and we have decided to be the determinants of the course of our nation's history. And like I said, what will be critical in the end will be whether Shahbag remains just a moment in time or whether we can convert it into a process.
All right, thanks to Tazrina Sajjad, Mahtab Haider, and Sabanaz Rashid Dia. We're going to see you all in our post-show, so don't go anywhere. Please join us at stream.aljazeera.com. Welcome to the Stream's online post show. We want to get back to our conversation. Mahtab Haider, I want to pick up with you. There was a law, essentially, that was put into place on Sunday that allows the state to appeal the verdict of a war crimes court. And the leader of the Jamaat party said on Monday that the government decision to do that could lead Bangladesh into a state of anarchy. What do you say to that?
Well, I think the rhetoric in Bangladesh is very much, especially the political rhetoric, is very charged with violence. And the Jamaat-e-Islami actually declared that they would plunge the country into a civil war even before the first or the second verdict were given out. So I'm not really surprised that this kind of violent rhetoric is being used centered around these war crimes trials.
Tazrina, there is increasing pressure on the government to actually ban Jamaat-e-Islami Party and those linked to it. How do you see that playing out? Do you think that's a real possibility?
Well, it's important not to get into the predictive game of what is going to happen as a consequence of Shahbag. Of course, this seems to be definitely a strong movement if it's entered into its third week. And the fact that, you know, when people and youth can actually push back, for example, when a strike is called, when people feel even more a greater sense of urgency when what they call one of their own is killed, there is a growing sense of consolidation of the message, perhaps. I think it's a far more complex conversation to be had. With regard to the Jamaat-e-Islami, people are obviously a lot of people are uncomfortable with their presence in politics because of their direct link to 1971. There's also the argument to be had with regard to, well, a lot of the members of the Jamaat-e-Islami today did not necessarily take part in the war, human rights atrocities, and in a democratic system and structure, they may also play a role in terms of an organized political party, and then the question is, you know, will people vote for them or not? So there are many different sides of this debate, but one of the things to, of course, consider is how does this Shahbag movement, and I think Mahtab touched on it, from an event, if it needs to become a process, and one of the long-term issues it needs to challenge is the language of and the use of political violence in the political culture of the country. That is one of the core issues. The other question is when there is, with regards to the way the movement is growing as an organic process in using culture, using music, using poetry and interaction with intellectuals, the larger question is the mood of the country towards a secularism defined in Bangladeshi terms? And is the conversation then about the banning of religion in politics? And that's a broader question than just talking about the Jamaat-e-Islami.
You just raised a point that our community member just raised not too long ago, and of course the rate of tweets now is 68 per minute, so it's a lot coming in. Iftikhar says people from all corners of life came demanding a ban on religious politics, which is what you just said. Another tweet from Salwa Mustafa, who says people took the Shahbag because they felt justice system had been manipulated to let a proven guilty killer walk free. Mahtab, I want to go to you because you've been at these protests. How have the demands evolved over the past few days?
I think the demands have evolved from initially a discussion on or a wholesale rejection of the verdict to a broader consensus that religion has no place in politics in Bangladesh. And this is the consensus very much within Shahbag, and I think in a much broader sense in Bangladeshi society, because if you go back to Bangladesh's history, in 1971, it was a wholesale rejection of Pakistan, which was carved out as a Muslim or an Islamic state, and it was a wholesale rejection of that idea. And in its place, the struggle to establish Bangladesh's identity as a Bengali state, which was at the center of the liberation struggle. So I very much think that in their hearts and minds, Bangladeshis see their primary identity as being Bengali. Of course, there are other ethnicities, and those ethnicities will also matter, but I think it's ethnicity that's the marker rather than religion.
Dia, these things like these protests, they don't have endless momentum. They have a finite lifespan. So eventually this is going to start winding down, or it's going to have to transition into something else. Where do you see it going?
I think the way I see it, I mean, Mahtab Bhai touched on a very good point. He's saying that this sort of evolved into from a direct rejection of the verdict to a political to something to banning religion in the from politics. And I think the way this is sort of converging, we are heading towards a point, a break even, where we can say that our judicial system is separate from our political system. We are not against religion; we are against fundamentalism. This movement is not against Islam; it's against extreme Islam or extreme any religion. And I think that sort of process is actually sort of taking place in Shahbag right now. I mean, people are still gathering there, but people are more strategic. People are more well placed, and the fact that the demands have sort of evolved by itself through a very natural process that shows that this movement, while it has a very long, tenuous process, it has certain finite goals to it, and that can be achieved as long as the pressure is on. So yeah, definitely right there.
And speaking of keeping the pressure on, Tazrina, there's a video comment here. Have a listen.
First time in the history of Bangladesh that young bloggers and online activists have created a movement of such a large scale that major political parties are compelled to acknowledge it.
Politicians are now being held accountable to bloggers. Is that something we're going to see more often?
I think, again, we have to be careful in terms of looking way into the future to try and understand how this is all going to play out. A couple of things for us to keep in mind. The use of social media for political activism really perhaps came to light with regard to the Twitter revolution or the Green Revolution in Iran. And I think a lot of our interest has been really garnered, especially with regard to what's been happening in the Middle East in the last 2 years. Now, again, not to draw any parallels or to come to conclusions, but the fact that the youth have a voice, that they're technically savvy, they're far more able to create sound bites that get them mobilized in a way, and of course to obviously occupy space that institutionalized politics generally occupy, which is forms of communication and forms of media outlets. So this is one that is for the greater part largely uncensored, although of course if it is seen to be too much of an anti-government stance that they're taking, of course this is not a revolution, this is not about the overthrow of a particular form of government. So there is enough space for the young people to actually capitalize on with regard to how they're communicating, mobilizing, coordinating with each other.
All right, Tazrina, I'm going to have to stop you there because we're out of time, but our thanks to Tazrina Sajjad, Mahtab Haider, and Sabanza Rashid Dia. Now, before we part entirely today, Malika has just a couple other stories that we're following.
Black is beautiful. That's the slogan behind a new anti-skin bleaching campaign that's spreading online in Senegal. The Noul Cook initiative, which means all black in Senegal's national language, is throwing its social media weight around with a Twitter hashtag and billboards featuring dark-skinned women like this one. The campaign's meant to combat lightning cream ads like this for Kles Petch, which means all white, and it's popped up in the Senegalese capital. The cream promises to make skin lighter in 15 days. In response, the Facebook page for the All Black campaign calls on readers to share pictures of dark-skinned beauty. Senegalese celebrities and activists are also among the faces featured on the site. Well, skin bleaching has become a public health concern, according to one Senegalese dermatologist. Fatima Talai says 67 out of every 100 women in the country practice artificial depigmentation. Our next lead comes from you, our community. We've been flooded with requests to cover the case of Samer Issawi, a Palestinian prisoner on hunger strike. On Tuesday, his latest attempt to be released on bail from Israeli administrative detention was deferred. He's refused food for more than 200 days to protest Israel's indefinite detention of Palestinians without charge or trial. Supporter Mariam Barghouti tweeted from outside the court, Samer Issawi's court is now over. His mother fainted as he left, and the Israeli court postponed the decision. 211 days of hunger strike and counting. The case has garnered much attention online. Supporter Camelia Fatiha posted this picture of protesters waiting for the court's decision. Well, we're reading your tweets and your Facebook posts, so if you want us to cover a story like this, respond to our daily call for stories using the hashtag AJStream. Lisa?
All right, on Wednesday's program, have African Americans reclaimed racist language? We speak with Dr. Cornell West about the evolution and use of the N-word. So send us your thoughts and your questions on that. And until then, we'll see you online.